The call came in at 5:16 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve, 2002. A woman named Karen Servas had found a dog wandering the neighborhood, a golden retriever mix, leash still attached, muddy paws, no owner in sight. She returned the dog to the house at 523 Covenant Avenue in Modesto, California, knocked on the door and got no answer. The porch light was off. The curtains were drawn. A wreath hung on the front door, the kind of seasonal decoration that makes a house look inhabited, even when it isn't. She assumed whoever lived there had simply stepped out. She left the dog in the backyard, latched the gate behind her, walked the 40 feet back to her own house, and didn't think much more of it. By 11:17 that same night, Sharon Rocha was on the phone with Modesto police, her voice breaking in the specific way that voices break when a person has been holding something together for hours and finally cannot anymore. Her daughter, 8 months pregnant, due in February, expecting a son, had not been seen since morning. The house on Covenant Avenue was empty. The dog was back in the yard, still wearing his leash. The Christmas dinner Sharon had prepared was sitting on the table, untouched, and her son-in-law, Scott Peterson, had been out fishing all day, alone, on Christmas Eve, 90 miles from home, in a boat he had owned for less than 3 weeks, on a bay that was 48 degrees and running with winter chop. That detail, a man who chose to spend Christmas Eve fishing alone while his pregnant wife stayed home, would become the first thread investigators would pull. And the more they pulled, the more the entire story of this marriage began to unravel in ways that nobody in that quiet Modesto neighborhood could have anticipated when December 24th began. To understand how a missing persons report filed on Christmas Eve became one of the most closely watched murder trials in American history, it is necessary to go back further, not years, just months, because the life Laci Peterson was living in the fall of 2002 looked from the outside like exactly the kind of life people spend years trying to build. A house, a husband, a dog, a baby on the way, a name already chosen, a nursery already painted. Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4th, 1975, in Modesto, California. The San Joaquin Valley city, of roughly 200,000 people, flat and agricultural, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and where the local news covers high school football with the same seriousness it gives to city council meetings. She grew up in a close family. Her mother Sharon, her stepfather Ron Gransky, her brother Brent. People who knew her as a child and as a young woman describe a person who was genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that isn't performed for an audience but is simply the way someone moves through the world. She laughed easily, she cooked, she gardened. She was, by every account from people who had no reason to idealize her, someone who made the room she walked into feel a little more inhabited. She studied horticulture at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, a campus set in the coastal hills about 200 miles south of Modesto, where the agriculture program is serious, and the students who enroll in it tend to be people who like working with their hands and understanding how things grow. It was there, sometime in the late 1990s, that she met Scott Peterson. He was 2 years older, a golf management major, handsome in a clean-cut way, with a manner that struck people as smooth, the kind of smooth that could read as either genuine confidence or a very good imitation of it, depending on who was paying attention and how closely. They dated through college. They moved in together. They got engaged. They married on August 9th, 2001, in a ceremony held in Solvang, California, a small town in Santa Barbara County built around a Danish architectural theme, the kind of place people choose for weddings because it photographs well and feels like somewhere that isn't quite the ordinary world. The reception was warm and well attended. Family photographs from that day show Laci in white, smiling in the way that people smile when they believe the moment is exactly what it appears to be. They moved to Modesto. Scott took a position in fertilizer sales for a company called Trade Corp, working out of a warehouse on Emerald Avenue on the south side of the city. Laci worked as a substitute teacher for a period, then helped manage a local restaurant called The Shack. They bought the house at 523 Covenant Avenue, a single-story home in a quiet residential neighborhood, beige stucco, a two-car garage, a backyard with a lemon tree. They got the golden retriever and named him Mackenzie. And in the spring of 2002, they found out Laci was pregnant. They were going to name him Connor. By December of 2002, Laci was 33 weeks along. She was due in February. She had painted the nursery a warm yellow. She had registered for gifts at a local baby store. She had told friends and family she was feeling well, tired in the way that all women in their third trimester are tired but happy. She had plans for Christmas Eve: make gingerbread cookies in the morning, attend a family dinner at her mother's house that evening. Sharon Rocha had set a place for her at the table. The chair was already there, waiting. The cookies were never made, and Laci Peterson was never seen alive again. When Sharon Rocha called police on the night of December 24th, the initial response was measured. A missing persons report, standard procedure, filed and assigned. But within hours, the circumstances had already begun to feel wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. Scott's account of his day was this: he had left the house at approximately 9:30 in the morning, driven the 90 miles west to the Berkeley Marina on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay, launched his 14-foot aluminum fishing boat, a vessel he had purchased on December 9th, paying cash, telling no one, and spent the day fishing for sturgeon. He said he returned home around 10:30 that night to find the house empty, the dog in the backyard with his leash still attached, and no sign of Laci. Detectives responding to the house that night noted several things. The marina was an unusual choice for a casual Christmas Eve outing. San Francisco Bay in late December runs cold and rough, with water temperatures in the low 40s and winds that make small boat fishing genuinely unpleasant for anyone who isn't experienced and determined. The boat was so new that Scott had not yet registered it with the state. He had told no one he was going fishing that day, not his wife, not his parents, not any friend. He had no fishing companion. He had no catch. His fishing license, when investigators checked, had been purchased only recently, and when asked directly how he felt about his wife's disappearance, his demeanor was, in the words of one detective who later testified in court, flat in a way that didn't match the situation. Not the flatness of shock, which has its own particular quality, something else. But in those first hours, none of that was evidence. It was atmosphere. It was instinct. And Modesto police had a missing pregnant woman to find. The search began on Christmas morning. Volunteers gathered at the neighborhood around Covenant Avenue before sunrise, bundled against the cold, carrying flashlights. Flyers were printed and distributed within 24 hours. Laci's face, her dark hair, her 8 months pregnant silhouette, a phone number to call. Local television stations in Modesto and Sacramento picked up the story by December 26th. National cable news followed within days. CNN and Fox News assigned correspondents. The story had the elements that drive sustained media attention: a beautiful young woman, a pregnancy, a holiday, a husband whose behavior was already generating questions in the court of public opinion, even before it generated questions in any courtroom. Sharon Rocha appeared on camera repeatedly in those early days. Her eyes were red, her voice barely held together. She asked anyone who had seen her daughter to come forward, to call the tip line, to help. Scott Peterson also appeared on camera, multiple times in multiple interviews. And it was in these appearances that something began to crystallize for people watching. He was composed, precisely, carefully composed. He spoke about Laci in measured sentences, choosing his words with a deliberateness that some interpreted as grief and others interpreted as something else entirely. He used the past tense on at least one occasion, referring to Laci in a way that implied she was gone rather than missing, before any body had been found, before any confirmation of death. It was a small thing, a slip of grammar, perhaps, or the kind of verbal shortcut that exhausted people make. Investigators noted it. It would later be scrutinized in court. He told reporters he was hopeful, and that he believed his wife would come home. He hugged his mother-in-law on camera. He stood at a podium at a press conference and asked the public for help finding Laci. He organized search parties. He was visible, cooperative, and present in every way that a grieving husband was supposed to be. But behind the scenes, Modesto police had already quietly shifted their focus. Scott Peterson was not just a grieving husband. He was, in the careful language of investigative procedure, a person of interest. And the reason for that would become public in a way that nobody, not the investigators, not the public, and certainly not Scott Peterson, could have anticipated. The reason became clear on January 24th, 2003. 31 days after Laci disappeared, a woman named Amber Frey held a press conference in Fresno, California, approximately 60 miles south of Modesto. She was 31 years old, a massage therapist, a single mother. She stood at a microphone in front of cameras from every major network and said what she had come to say. She had been in a romantic relationship with Scott Peterson since November 2002, while Laci was pregnant with Connor. She had met Scott through a mutual friend named Sean Sibley. She had not known he was married. She had not known he had a pregnant wife at home. She had found out on December 26th, 2 days after Laci disappeared, when the story went public, and someone who knew her called to ask if the man she was seeing was the same man on the news. It was. And since December 30th, she had been cooperating with Modesto police. She had been recording her phone calls with Scott. The press conference changed the temperature of the entire investigation in a matter of hours. Within days, the story had moved from local tragedy to national obsession in a way that even the first weeks of coverage hadn't fully achieved. Cable news devoted hours each day to the case. Legal analysts debated the significance of the affair, whether it constituted motive, whether it was admissible, whether it proved anything at all about what had happened to Laci. And investigators, now armed with something concrete, a motive, a secret, a lie that Scott had been maintaining, even as he stood in front of cameras asking the public for help, pressed harder on every thread they had been quietly pulling since Christmas Eve. Those recorded phone calls between Scott Peterson and Amber Frey are extraordinary documents, and they were played in their entirety for the jury during the trial. In them, Scott continues to court her. He tells her he loves her. He describes watching the New Year's Eve celebrations from Paris. He is, in fact, sitting in his car in a parking lot in Modesto, watching a candlelight vigil for his missing wife from a distance, close enough to see the candles, but far enough to remain unrecognized. He tells Amber he is watching the Eiffel Tower on television. He describes the fireworks over the Seine. He is constructing a fiction in real time, with the ease of someone who has done this before, and he is doing it while his wife has been missing for a week, and the mother of his child has not been found. Amber Frey, for her part, asks careful questions. She had been briefed by detectives before each call. She keeps him talking. She gently probes. She asks about Laci without asking about Laci directly. Over the course of dozens of hours of recorded conversation, calls that stretched across weeks into January and February of 2003, Scott never once breaks down about his wife's disappearance in the way that would be expected from a man in his situation. He does not cry. He does not express the kind of raw, desperate grief that tends to be uncontrollable when it is real. He compartmentalizes with a precision that investigators listening to the recordings found deeply unsettling, not because grief takes only one form, but because the form his took was indistinguishable from a man who had nothing to grieve. Meanwhile, the physical search continued. Hundreds of volunteers combed parks, drainage channels, agricultural fields, and waterways throughout Stanislaus County. The Berkeley Marina was searched by boat. Police divers went into the cold water of San Francisco Bay. Nothing was found. Weeks passed. Then 2 months. The investigation was generating evidence: phone records, financial documents, interviews, the recorded calls. But it had a fundamental gap that all of it together could not close. Without a body, the case could not move forward in the way prosecutors needed it to move. And then, on April 13th, 2003, 109 days after Laci Peterson disappeared, a man walking his dog along the shoreline of Point Isabel Regional Shoreline in Richmond, California, a stretch of coast on the eastern edge of San Francisco Bay, roughly 5 miles north of the Berkeley Marina, discovered the partial remains of a fetus that had washed up on the rocks. The remains were small. The umbilical cord was still attached. The next day, approximately 1 mile south, along the same shoreline, the partial remains of a woman were found. The decomposition was severe. 4 months in cold salt water leaves very little intact. But there were enough identifiable features for investigators to begin the process of confirmation. The identification took several days. DNA analysis confirmed what investigators had suspected since the night of December 24th. The woman was Laci Peterson. The fetus was Connor. They had been found on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay, the same body of water where Scott Peterson said he had spent Christmas Eve alone in a 14-foot aluminum boat, fishing for sturgeon, catching nothing, telling no one. Scott Peterson was arrested 5 days later, on April 18th, 2003, in a parking lot of a golf course in La Jolla, California, nearly 400 miles south of Modesto, in a city that borders the Pacific and sits close enough to the Mexican border to make the direction of travel significant. He had driven there in a car that did not belong to him. He had over $14,000 in cash. He was carrying multiple cell phones. He had dyed his hair from its natural dark brown to a sandy blonde. He was carrying his brother's identification. In the car, investigators found camping equipment, a shovel, a length of rope, and additional cash. He had also, in the weeks following Laci's disappearance, made inquiries about properties available for rent in Mexico. He was taken into custody without incident in the parking lot, under a San Diego sky that was clear and warm in the way that Southern California in April tends to be. The charge: 2 counts of murder, first degree for Laci, second degree for Connor, under California Penal Code, Section 187, the state's fetal homicide statute, which defines murder as the unlawful killing of a human being or a fetus with malice aforethought. The trial began in June 2004 in Redwood City, California, a city in San Mateo County on the peninsula south of San Francisco, chosen after a successful motion for change of venue on the grounds that media saturation in Stanislaus County had made a fair jury pool impossible to assemble there. Judge Alfred DeLucchi presided. He was 68 years old, experienced, and known for running a tight courtroom. The prosecution team was led by District Attorney Rick DiStasso and Deputy District Attorney Dave Harris. The defense was led by Mark Geragos, a Los Angeles-based attorney who had represented clients including Michael Jackson and Winona Ryder, and who had made the unusual decision to declare Scott Peterson innocent publicly on national television before formally taking the case, a declaration that would later complicate his position considerably when the evidence began to accumulate in ways his television appearances had not accounted for. The prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, and the prosecution said so plainly at the outset. There was no confession, there was no eyewitness to the crime, there was no murder weapon. There was no definitive cause of death established for Laci. Her remains, after 4 months in San Francisco Bay, were too degraded by decomposition, by salt water, by tidal action, to allow a forensic pathologist to determine with certainty how she had died. The medical examiner could say she was dead. The medical examiner could not say exactly how. What the prosecution had instead was a constellation of facts, each one individually explainable, but which together, they argued, pointed in only one direction and required a degree of coincidence that strained credibility to its breaking point. Scott had purchased the boat in secret. He paid cash. He told no one, not Laci, not his parents, not his friends, not his co-workers. The purchase date was December 9th, 2002, 15 days before Laci disappeared. Investigators examining the boat found traces of concrete on the interior hull, the kind of concrete consistent with homemade anchors, heavy objects that could be used to weigh something down in deep water. A subsequent search of the warehouse on Emerald Avenue, where Scott worked, found evidence that he had been mixing concrete in the weeks before Christmas. The prosecution argued that he had made anchors, loaded them into the boat, and used them on Christmas Eve. The location where the bodies were found was in the prosecution's telling, not a coincidence. Forensic oceanographer Ralph Cheng testified about the tidal patterns, current behavior, and wind conditions in San Francisco Bay during the period between late December 2002 and mid-April 2003. His analysis showed that an object dropped from a boat near the Berkeley Marina in late December, given the bay's average current speed, tidal cycle, and prevailing winter winds, would be expected to drift to the eastern shoreline of the bay, near Richmond, near Point Isabel, over a period of roughly 3 to 4 months. The bodies were found at the eastern shoreline of the bay, approximately 3.5 months after Laci disappeared. The math, Chung testified, was consistent. The prosecution also presented evidence of Scott's behavior in the weeks following Laci's disappearance that they characterized as inconsistent with that of a man genuinely searching for his missing wife. He had contacted a real estate agent about listing the house on Covina Avenue for sale. He had accessed a joint bank account and withdrawn funds. He had continued his relationship with Amber Frey. He had, by the testimony of multiple witnesses, shown little of the frantic, consuming desperation that tends to characterize a person whose pregnant spouse has vanished without explanation. He attended vigils. He spoke to cameras. He went through the motions. But the private behavior, investigators argued, told a different story. The defense countered with an alternative theory that was, in its architecture, designed to introduce reasonable doubt rather than to prove any particular competing version of events. Mark Garagos argued that Laci had been abducted by a satanic cult, a claim that drew on a reported sighting of a woman matching Laci's description being forced into a van near the Covina Avenue neighborhood on the morning of December 24th. He argued that her body had been placed in the bay by someone else, specifically to frame Scott, after his fishing trip to the marina became public knowledge. He presented witnesses who said they had seen a pregnant woman walking in the neighborhood after the time Scott claimed to have already left for Berkeley. He challenged the current analysis, the concrete evidence, and the reliability of the investigation itself. He also challenged the Amber Frey evidence on the grounds that an affair, however morally troubling, does not constitute evidence of murder. People have affairs and do not kill their spouses. The affair proved Scott Peterson was unfaithful. It did not prove he was a murderer. That argument legally was not wrong, but the jury had to weigh it against everything else. Deliberations were complicated by the dismissal of multiple jurors during the process, a procedural drama that played out publicly over several weeks, generating its own round of media coverage and legal commentary. 2 jurors were dismissed for cause during deliberations, replaced by alternates, which required the reconstituted jury to begin deliberations again from the start. Legal analysts debated whether the dismissals were appropriate, whether they had been influenced by external pressure, whether the process had been contaminated. Judge DeLucchi managed it carefully, and the deliberations continued. On November 12, 2004, nearly 2 years after Laci Peterson disappeared on Christmas Eve, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on both counts. First-degree murder for Laci. Second-degree murder for Connor. The courtroom was quiet in the way that courtrooms get quiet when something that has been building for a very long time finally arrives. Sharon Rocha was present. She closed her eyes when the verdict was read. The penalty phase followed within days. The jury heard additional testimony about the impact of the crime. Sharon Rocha spoke about her daughter, about Connor, about the Christmas dinner that sat on the table uneaten, about the years since. On December 13, 2004, the jury recommended the death penalty. Judge Alfred DeLucchi formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death on March 16, 2005. He was transported to San Quentin State Prison, to the section of that institution that houses California's death row, a place where men wait in a particular kind of suspension, convicted, sentenced, appealing, alive. The years that followed were not quiet. Scott Peterson maintained his innocence from San Quentin, and his legal team pursued appeals through the California appellate system with the methodical patience that post-conviction work requires. In 2020, the California Supreme Court issued a significant ruling. It overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, not because the court found questions about his guilt, not because new evidence had emerged that cast doubt on the murder conviction. The court overturned the death sentence because of juror misconduct during the penalty phase, specifically because one juror had failed to disclose, during the jury selection process, prior contact with law enforcement related to a domestic violence incident in her own life. That failure to disclose, the court found, constituted grounds for reversal of the penalty. The murder conviction itself remained intact. Scott Peterson was resentenced in December 2021. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred from San Quentin's death row to the general population of another California state prison. He remains incarcerated. But the legal story did not end there, and this is the part that keeps the case open in a technical sense even now. In 2020, defense attorneys filed new motions, raising a separate claim. One focused not on the penalty phase, but on the murder conviction itself. The claim centered on a woman referred to in court documents as a Ponte, who had been living in the neighborhood near Kavanaugh Avenue in late 2002. According to the defense, this woman had been connected to a residential burglary of a home near the Petersons on the morning of December 24th, and the defense argued that she or people associated with her may have encountered Laci Peterson during the commission of that crime. The defense characterized this as newly discovered evidence, information that had not been available to the defense at the time of the 2004 trial, and that, had it been available, might have produced a different outcome. The Stanislaus County Superior Court agreed to examine the claim. Beginning in 2022 and continuing into 2023, the court held a series of evidentiary hearings. Witnesses were called, documents were reviewed. The legal question before the court was narrow but consequential. Did this evidence meet the standard required to grant a new trial? As of the time the script was finalized, the court had not issued a final ruling. The door to a new trial has not been opened. It has also not been fully closed. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, published a memoir in 2006 titled For Laci. It is not an easy book to read. She describes the Christmas Eve dinner in detail, the table she set, the food she prepared, the chair she had placed for Laci, the hours of waiting as the evening passed, and the phone calls went unanswered. She describes the moment she understood that something was genuinely wrong. She describes the years of grief that followed. The way grief of that kind does not resolve, does not conclude, does not arrive at a place where a person is finished with it. She has attended court proceedings. She has testified. She has spoken publicly about her belief in Scott's guilt and her continued pain at the loss of both her daughter and her unborn grandson. She has not stopped speaking Laci's name. Amber Frey published her own account in 2005, titled Witness for the Prosecution of Scott Peterson. She described the relationship, the moment she learned who Scott Peterson actually was, and the months she spent recording phone calls for investigators while managing her own shock and grief at what she had been drawn into without her knowledge. She cooperated fully with the prosecution and was praised by investigators for the quality of the recorded evidence she helped gather. She has largely stepped away from public life in the years since the trial concluded. Scott Peterson's parents, Lee and Jackie Peterson, have consistently and publicly supported their son's claims of innocence. They have participated in documentary projects, given interviews, and argued that the investigation was flawed from its earliest days, that the jury was biased by media coverage, and that their son was convicted not on evidence but on the emotional weight of a story that the public had already decided how to read before the trial began. They continue to advocate for his release. What the case of Laci Peterson leaves behind is not, in the legal sense, a mystery. A jury examined the evidence for months, deliberated carefully under difficult procedural circumstances, and returned a verdict. A judge imposed a sentence. An appellate court reviewed the process and found the conviction sound. But the case has continued to generate examination, continued to appear in law school curricula and investigative training programs and documentary series because of what it demonstrates about the architecture of circumstantial cases, how individual facts that each admit of innocent explanation can, in sufficient number and sufficient alignment, construct something that a jury finds more persuasive than the alternative. There is also the question of Connor and what his inclusion in the charges meant legally and morally. California's fetal homicide statute extends the definition of murder to include the killing of a fetus with malice aforethought. The jury convicted Scott Peterson of second-degree murder for Connor, not first-degree, as they found for Laci. That distinction suggests they drew some line, perhaps about premeditation, perhaps about the specific circumstances of Connor's death, as distinct from his mother's. Juries are not required to explain their verdicts, and this one never did. Legal scholars have written extensively about the statute and its application here, about what it means to extend criminal culpability to the death of a fetus, about the implications for future cases. The debate continues in academic and legal circles. The verdict does not. What is not in dispute is this. On Christmas morning, 2002, a golden retriever walked the streets of a quiet Modesto neighborhood with his leash dragging on the pavement. His name was Mackenzie. His owner had not come home. Her name was Laci Peterson. She was 27 years old. She was 8 months pregnant. She had plans for Christmas dinner. She had gingerbread to make. She had a nursery painted yellow, waiting in the house on Covina Avenue, and a name already chosen for the boy who was going to sleep in it. The morning light in Modesto on December 25th would have been pale and cold. The kind of California winter morning that doesn't look like winter from a distance, but feels like it when you're standing outside. A thin frost on the car roofs, the air carrying the smell of agricultural fields and dormant citrus. The street on Covina Avenue was quiet. The neighbors were inside with their families. The dog waited in the yard. And somewhere in San Francisco Bay, in water that was 48 degrees and dark even at noon, Laci Peterson was already gone. That is the fact at the center of this case. Everything else, the trial, the appeals, the books, the documentaries, the ongoing hearings in a Stanislaus County courtroom, circles around it. A woman who was there in the morning was not there by evening. The person who last saw her alive was the person charged with her death, and the jury, after examining months of evidence in a Redwood City courtroom, decided that the evidence was enough. Whether the new claims raised in subsequent hearings will change any part of that legal conclusion remains to be seen. The California courts have not yet closed that door entirely. But the door that matters most, the one that Laci Peterson never walked back through on Christmas Eve, has been closed for more than 20 years. The case is taught in law schools. It is referenced in training materials for investigators working circumstantial homicide cases. It appears in discussions of media influence on jury pools, of fetal homicide law, of what it means to build a prosecution without a confession, without an eyewitness, without a definitive cause of death, and it is remembered above all by the people who loved her, who spent Christmas 2002 waiting at a dinner table that had one empty chair, and who have been waiting in a different way ever since. If this case stayed with you, the weight of the evidence, the slow accumulation of detail that built a case without a single definitive moment, the way a constellation of facts can point in one direction without any single one of them being conclusive, there is another investigation on this channel that worked the same way. Years of circumstantial threads, a disappearance that looked, at first, like it might never be resolved. A jury that had to decide what the evidence meant when the evidence never quite spoke for itself. It is waiting for you next.